Hey gang, Dr. G, Imaginarium. Got something special for you today on Mysteries of the Psyche here on Sunday. This is a recording of a presentation that philosopher and psychoanalyst John Mills and I gave at the C.G. Jung Institute in Los Angeles last year, promoting our new book, Archetypal Ontology, that came out last year. The format of the talk is John will be talking first about his contribution to the book. Then there'll be some questions, and then I talk, and then there's more questions. It's pretty long, but got a lot of stuff in it. So hopefully you can sit back and enjoy that. And don't forget to click the like button.
Just informally, I really did not become acquainted with Jungian studies until I'd say about 13 years ago, when I had at the time I thought I was going to die in an airplane crash, and I had a numinous experience of surviving, and I immediately knew that this was something I needed to delve into personally and in my research. So I started reading Jung's collective works, which led to my first paper. As a philosopher, I was interested in the philosophical ideas behind Jung's collective works, and I wrote a paper called Jung's Metaphysics. And after that, I had decided to write a few more papers. I went to my first Jungian conference in Cape Town, South Africa in 2017. And that's where I had the good fortune to meet a lot of lovely people from the Jungian community, and particularly from the International Association for Jungian Studies, which hosted the conference. And I immediately fell in love with the people. I've been in different circles, classically trained Freudian scholar, Lacanian, and as well as a contemporary critic of intersubjectivity and relational psychoanalysis. So coming around to Jung was rounding out my self-education. But it's led to me into different directions. And so when I met Eric Goodwyn, we immediately started to have a simpatico about our thinking and an interest in the archetypes. And Eric, of course, is a pioneer in this before myself. So having engaged in a series of dialogues about what is what is the foundation of Jungian thinking, led us to this book that we called Archetypal Ontology. So hopefully this is not going to be too heavy, but I hope to make it, at least my talk, digestible, and would then value some kind of discussion with the audience afterwards. So let me begin. Arguably, the most definitive feature of Jung's metapsychology is his theory of archetypes. It is the fulcrum on which his analytical depth psychology rests. To this day, there is no unified consensus on what constitutes an archetype. Even Jung himself was murky at best. Isn't that unbelievable, though? The very foundation of Jungian thought, we cannot agree upon what it is. Jungians are divided and propose contradictory, if not sometimes unintelligible, theories about the ground, breadth, and limits to archetypal discourse, ranging from uncritical acceptance of classical paradigms to dismissing the notion altogether. Jung's notion of the archetype remains an equivocal concept, so much so that Jungians and post-Jungians have failed to agree on its essential nature. I wish to argue that an archetype may be understood as an unconscious schemata that is self-constitutive and emerges into consciousness from its own a priori ground, hence an autonomous self-determinate act derived from archaic ontology. I'd like to briefly set out here today to philosophically investigate the essence of an archetype by examining its origins and dialectical reflections as a process system arising from its own autochthonous parameters. As an overview, I will offer a descriptive explication of the inner constitution and birth of an archetype based on internal rupture and the desire to project its universality, form, and patternings into psychic reality as self-instantiating replicators. Archetypal content is the appearance of essence as the products of self-manifestation. For an archetype must appear in order to be made actual. Here we must seriously question that in the beginning, if an archetype is self-constituted and self-generative, the notion and validity of a collective unconscious becomes rather dubious, if not superfluous. The infrastructure of the brain is not the same as the psyche, which is a higher order agency, a complex, self-determinate process system arising from its original dialectical unconscious organization. Although our embodiment is necessary and makes the experiential apparatus and internalization process possible, it is not sufficient condition to explain psyche. Neither is our environmental facticity. What is missing from the equation is that intermediate mediatory sphere of the capacity to spontaneously express and actualize freedom in all its glory and shortcomings. This is where the language of archetypes intervenes nicely as a potential explicans. In other words, an archetype is self-constituted and self-generative within the context and confines of its immediate ontological thrownness. For Jung, the nature of reality is psychic process, constituted as an impersonal animating force that is superimposed on human experience and transgenerationally transmitted throughout the ages. This is the doctrine of archetypes. Although Jung was very inconsistent in his thinking on the nature of the archetypes, which went through many theoretical revisions through his lifetime, including viewing them as instincts, images, forms, affect and fantasy, patterns of behavior, and a numinous mystical category, and even as immaterial entities. He was not very impressed with having to think the same thing all the time. This is one reason why there continues to be confusion, contradiction, and lack of consensus in the archetype debate that is still very much alive in esoteric scholarly circles. Increasingly, throughout his career, Jung began to refer to archetypes as autonomous, as autocratic, and manifesting themselves involuntarily to consciousness, hence having a degree and level of independence emanating from the unconscious, which are, quote, experienced as spontaneous entities, end quote. And that, quote, arise from self-creative acts. Following Jung, who attributes subjectivity to archetypes, if we come to view the archetype as a psychic arranger, much like a soul animator that coordinates, controls, and directs the internal relations, forms, contents, and modes of unconscious process, then we may not inappropriately refer to this mediatory organizer as an unconscious nucleus or impersonal microagency, spewing forth self states into consciousness as the dispersal of its internal essence, with quasi autonomous properties bubbling up from within the deep abyss. What develops is a sense of agency or selfhood that makes further self-experience and self-learning possible. The content of such self-dispersal we have come to label and identify as manifestations of the archetypal. While I would argue the archetype as such is occluded, we experience and know its presence as appearances within consciousness. In a previous book of mine, or it's called Origins, on the Genesis of Psychic Reality, I offer a formal psychoanalytic metaphysics articulating the birth of psychic agency. Unconscious mind is a series of spacings that first instantiate themselves as a multitude of schemata, which are the building blocks of psychic reality. A schema is a desirous, apperceptive, ideational unit of self-experience that is teleologically oriented and dialectically constituted. Schemas may be viewed as microagents with semi-autonomous powers of telic expression that operate as self-states as they create spacings within the unconscious mind. Schemata may take various forms, from the archaic to the refined, and materialize as somatic, sensuous, affective, perceptual, and conceptual, hence symbolic, orders within the psyche, each having their own intrinsic pressures, valences, intensities, intentional and defensive strategies, and unconscious qualia. The microdynamics of schematic expression can be highly individualistic in their bid for freedom, creativity, complexity, and agentic intent, and are tantamount to the instinctual, desirous, and defensive processes we are accustomed to attribute to unconscious mentation in general. The difference here is that schemata are inherently both free and determined, or perhaps more appropriately, freely determined. That is, they are self-constituted and determinate within the natural parameters in which they find themselves and operate. This means that schematic expression is highly contextual and contingent. Yet schemata exist in a multiplicity of process systems that commune, interact, and participate in a society of events that mutually influence the unique constitution of each schematic structure within the sea of the mind. This overdetermination of psychic processes ensures that unconscious agency ultimately underlies the constitution of all mental functioning. I wish to apply this conceptual scheme to the nature of an archetype. In my language, an archetype would be tantamount to unconscious schemata. There are two general theoretical frameworks we can adopt. One is that we merely assume archetypes are forms and fantasies with desirous affective image properties or imaginal properties that are generated by the mind derived from unconscious genesis. This view could conceivably be compatible with both Freudian and Jungian conceptions of the unconscious. The second option is that we adopt another speculative framework that attributes the powers of self-generation to the archetype itself. If an archetype is autonomous, according to Jung, and self-constituted, are we not justified in attributing a modicum of agency to its inner constitution? While I would not want to attribute selfhood to the constitution of an archetype, as if it were a self, a subject, or personality in its own right, strictly speaking, this would not rule out the possibility of agency with the capacity for determinate expression. In fact, there is a certain degree of teleology inherent to an archetype because it's oriented to express itself, to reveal itself in consciousness, to disclose itself from concealment in its quest to become manifest. Although an archetype is not a proper agent, it nevertheless exudes and executes agency by the mere fact that it appears in the psyche and in all societies. An archetype is therefore a paradigmatic prototype or exemplary model oriented to repeat itself as archaic form in psychic productions. There is a certain independence in an archetype's capacity towards self-assertion to impose its presence on psychic reality. In other words, if archetypes are self-states or quasi-micro-agents that cluster into their own autonomous organizations in the mind, they have their own internal relations and telic modes of expression. By applying the notion of unconscious schemata as a telic experiential process or self-manifestation, we may potentially explain how archetypes manifest from their primordial ontology. Let us first start with origins, from pre-beginning, the unconscious cosmologic act of creation. Because archetypes cannot just appear or blink into existence ex nihilo, they must emerge from a primal dynamic ground of self-experience. At the very least, we can say is that archetypes must derive from an unconscious organizing principle that is internally impelled to materialize, that is to become, and is hence subject to being apprehended in consciousness, or otherwise archetypes would never appear. Because of the innate autonomy to manifest, this means that an archetype by necessity would have an agentic character with a particular telos, which accounts for its multiplicity of forms or patterns, as well as its specific contents, themes, qualities, valences, intensities, and so forth. We may further speculate that because of the autonomous character, it is self-derived and self-activating, for without which it would not be released from its unconscious slumber or primal hiddenness. In other words, without such an agentic disposition or proclivity to project or externalize itself into psychic reality, it would not appear. The point here is that in order for an archetype to properly exist, it must make itself actual through determinative action as the coming into being of internal presence. An archetype is construed to be an internal presence, first and foremost, as a summoning of the interior. But we do not know exactly why it radiates its essence. If there is a prior subordinate force, field or system directing the process, and or what its essence really signifies, only that its source is from within. That's an epistemological position of how we come to know internal experience. It's from within. Those claiming, as Jung did, that archetypes are transpersonal, cosmic external occurrences or organizations superimposed on our interior, have a messy epistemological burden to reckon with. Taking on a collective unconscious agent, creator, or transsubjective entity only anthropomorphizes the construct and further problematizes the question of origins by conjuring up a supernatural macroanthropos. It may prove more useful to stay focused on how emergence may transpire from internality, as this is all we can directly know epistemically as phenomenal near inner experience. Here we only need to adopt the theoretic standpoint of internally derived activity to show its logical coherence. For appearance descends and springs from its prior dialectical movements. Before appearance, before archetypal manifestation, we must posit primordial ground as the a priori condition for the unfolding of unconscious phenomenology, or what I call ontophenomenology as inner ontology. Rather than solicit a collective supernatural process where archetypes are said to stem, we may more modestly begin with a naturalized account of psychic phenomenon derived from unconscious organizing principles governing internal psychological dynamics. Rather than import the philosophical implications of emanationism or supervenience, what is more plausible to me is that internal phenomenon condition our metaphysical postulates. And I believe this would be very commensurate with what Jung would say. While Jung would most probably agree with this, his incongruencies on the nature of the collective unconscious cloud a proper appreciation of the exact nature and essence of what constitutes an archetype. Proceeding from the proposition that archetypes are in essence internal presences, this is much less problematic than asserting their mind-independent existence coming from a psychic or a cosmic psyche that Dr. Goodwyn's going to talk about under the rubric of metaphysical realism. If we succeed in attributing a modicum of agency to the inner constitution of an archetype, then an archetype must have a motive, a telos as aim, to reveal itself, to express or externalize itself, to make its presence felt and known. In this regard, it is no different than an unconscious desire to fulfill a wish. And it does so by objectifying itself, that is, by making itself an object for consciousness. Archetypes arise in psyche for us. But how do they arise? In other words, what is the mechanism or process that precedes their appearance in consciousness? If archetypes are self-activating, then they must emerge from their own ground. In the beginning, I suggest, an archetype is a self-enclosed unity that must undergo internal division via splitting by its own hands in order to externalize itself from its unconscious void of indeterminateness. This would require an initial act of self-posit or self-assertion, where it would rouse or stir itself from indeterminateness to determinate being. that is, from unconscious parallax to conscious presence, from inarticulate implicitness to articulated explicitness in the psyche. In its initial awakening as self-arousal, an archetype must first take itself as its own content, which is at first its own simple unity, its original form. In taking its original form as its initial content, it performs its own self-mediation as a dialectical enactment of instituting differentiation into its form, which becomes the initial movement from a self-enclosed universality to a differentiated identity as the dispersal of particularity, the instantiation of its essence into psychic reality. This initial act of differentiation and modification becomes the logical model for further patterns and dialectical relations to transpire as archetypes are released and begin to populate mental life. Archetypes first must manifest as internal presence before they make their transition or trajectory to external presence, namely as concrete universals that take many forms, such as collective or anthropological motifs, myths, material productions, art and aesthetic expressions, social institutions, cultural organizations, civilizations, ideals, religious beliefs, customs, rituals, and so on. These examples are the derivatives of archetypes. Archetypes first manifest as unconscious subjectivity, only to become more rich and robust in content, schemata, and patternings when breaching into consciousness, and objectified in individual personality and the semiotic socio-symbolic structures that define and govern any culture. If an archetype is, at its most basic configuration, a patterning of a universal process, then such patterning cannot contain an empty formalism without jeopardizing the integrity of the theory. Rather, I argue that patterning of an archetype arises from its own internal divisions and splitting maneuvers that naturally introduce mediation between oppositions. Such mediations are two-way internal relations that properly belong to the dialectical form of an archetype that bears a basic structural content as the bifunctionality of identity and difference. When an archetype arouses itself through rupture from its self-enclosed slumber to the self-certainty of its own pre-reflective being, from implicitness to explicitness, it apprehends itself as unconscious apperception, the coming to presence of its inchoate simple form. In this initial act of apperception, an archetype performs a pre-subjective determination of instituting differentiation from its previous unmodified shape via reflection into itself, which raises itself to a determinate being for self as mediated self-certainty. Here, the apperceptive act of arousal simultaneously is the conferral of its own discrete identity that it sets over itself in relation to all particularities of difference. Opposition becomes the internal dynamic in which dialectical mediation takes place, which is ontically conjoined as an interplay between identity and difference. As an archetype intuits itself as an apperceptive being, it gives itself identity that stands in relation to otherness, an otherness that is necessary in order to concretize the act of self-definition as the awakening of its essence, as an internal impetus to manifest. Here we may say that an archetype originally becomes aware of itself as a pre-reflective burgeoning subjectivity, what we may call an unconscious self-consciousness, the simple self-apperceptive immediacy of its being. Now, why does an archetype have such an internal impetus to manifest? Because it lacks, because it desires. Here, the desire to wake, to apprehend itself, to manifest, is the expression of its own felt being in relation to lack. This is the prototype of the human psyche. Desire as being in relation to lack is the initial essential configuration of an archetype. For it wants to be, to experience, to become other than its mere self-enclosed unity. This breach into experience as desire to rectify its lack of being is the first expressive act of self-posit, which elevates the archetype to a living process. It feels compelled to externalize as the coming into being of its own actual existence. Here, our archetypal process is summarized as the need to experience as being toward life. Just as an archetype stirs the psyche through emotional seizure, it first experiences its own internal stirring as self-seizure to awaken and externalize its essence as a living process through self-rupture. We may further suggest that this initial act of self-posit is imbued with existential value and carries an emotional tone as it apprehends itself in its awakened self-immediacy. The organic sequence of such self-instantiation may further be viewed through the lens of a developmental monistic ontology. Moving from the upheaval of its own disquieted desire to self-apprehension constitutes the birth of the psyche and consequently the archetype, for which our own consciousness may, in turn, apprehend as a psychic entity or presence populating mental life. Just as an archetype is seized to self-awaken, so too is the human mind jarred to feel its internal presence. Of course, we could be speaking generically about raw affect or emotions in general, but the phenomenal experience is qualitatively different. Archetypes feel like they are connected to something outside of or independent from the self, despite the fact that they arise from and are encountered within. In this way, we may further say that an archetype is the epitome of otherness, for its experiential announcement and imposition on consciousness is registered as an unfettered event. The epistemology of this seemingly autonomous process is what adds a further layer of uncanniness and numinosity to the experience, if not alienation from its origins, even if we are mistaken or deluded in interpreting the agency of their internal recurrence. When the psyche comes to notice the myriad patterns in which archetypes manifest, a recurrent theme of repetition cannot escape the discerning, self-reflective cogito. Although archetypes are everywhere in psyche and culture, we must not lose sight of their fundamental significance. They are replications of original form. We may further say they are self-generating replicators, or we would not encounter their ubiquity without the antediluvian drive of spontaneous repetition. Civilization is compelled to reproduce them in our psychosocial arrangements that govern human exchange, based on the simple fact that we remember and rewrite history in our preoccupation with the past. This sociological observance highlights the primacy of looking back at, revisiting, acknowledging, and even savoring history as an idealized need for nostalgia, not as immediate presence, but as recapitulation or eternal recurrence. This is why the imaginary has such a strong hold over consciousness, for archetypes repeat themselves through images and associative fantasies that are more or less timeless. The notion or fantasy of eternal recurrence is the psychomythology the mind generates and gravitates toward in order to confer meaning and ground its being. In this way, archetypes are the foundation and fulfillment of archaic ontology. Every reproduction, every repetition stands in illo tempore as attempts at duplication and regeneration. Does an archetype perform a cognitive act? No, unless you consider it a psychological entity in its own right. Is it registered, felt, and perceived by the psyche? Yes. But is there really any difference between the two? In other words, is an archetype independent of mind and culture? Well, not likely. But does it appear as if it is an unconscious force in the psyche? Epistemologically, categorically, hence logically, and phenomenologically, yes. But can we ever really know its metaphysical status? To make an archetype supersensible, as Jung does by evoking Plato's eternal forms, is misguided, I argue, because this gives them a supernatural significance we are in no way capable of verifying. All we can know is naturalized experience, the coming into being of inner presence. Thank you very much.
Okay. Are there any questions based on John's talk so far? Please raise your hand using Zoom, or Eric, you can go ahead.
Well, I wanted to, of course, thank you for that great presentation. But I wanted to see if you would, for myself and for anyone else interested in the way that you described how an archetype emerges from the unconscious ground. If you had any examples to give us, and then showing us like at the different points, because you identified several different points of the splitting and then the existence in relation to lack and all that. And I love the way you do that. I was wondering if you could give us an example and show us like where these points happen to the degree that you can. Because if nothing comes to mind, I've got one.
I'm trying to think of something that's not personal, but perhaps that's difficult to do. How do I separate my sense of self and personhood from something that might be collective and impersonal? Well, I'll go back to my experience in this plane where we took a dive in the sky, and I mean, it was quite abrupt, and you know, people started screaming, we're dropping, and you know, the internal panic set in, and all of a sudden, the images of my family, my wife and children, just popped right into my mind, and their presence, their faces in the order of their birth, and it just immediately brought a calm over me. And one can say that's a personal unconscious, but at the same time, I would say that that would be archetypal as well, because it represents love and your family. But I know that doesn't have the same significance as more cultural myths and other motifs that you've done a tremendous amount of work on, Eric. So please tell us your example.
Well, what I was thinking of was a dream that was presented to me by a military vet, and he was having a lot of PTSD symptoms. He was about to separate from his active duty service, and he had a dream where he was engaged in intense urban combat in the States, which was something he never did in reality, not in the States. He did do urban combat overseas. And halfway through this dream, he needed to attend a ceremony. And so he went to his barracks, and everyone that was there in his whole life that he knew was there, and they were hungover, half asleep, and they didn't like him. And he said, I've got to attend the ceremony. Where is my uniform? And they all point to the wall, and he sees his uniform, and it's covered in blood and dirt. And he's devastated. And he runs away. He goes back into the urban combat, and he's given an assignment, and he has to find this bomb in the city. He finds the bomb, but he can't figure out how to disarm it, and it blows up. Okay. So now my analysis of this dream when I was working with him was that it was about the return of the warrior back to civilization. And the ceremony was the element that really, I think, tipped it off for me. Number one, it ends in tragedy, which means there's a process that's not occurring. But it seems to me this would be a good example of your process where there's a non-ego entity within the psyche that says you need to get into this ceremony, and you're running into these problems, and part of it has to do with shame, feeling rejected, not integrated into society, so forth, all that is imaged as the uniform. But does that match your process, or is there a way that you could explain how that imagery might emerge in someone through those different processes that you describe? Or do you have completely different interpretation?
We're looking at the micro dynamics of a particular person's psyche, and it's certainly hard when I'm talking at a really abstract level.
Yeah.
But let me give it a shot.
Well, let me just throw out what I've seen in your descriptive process. You describe in particular the relation to lack, which I think is very evident in archetypal images. And with him, there was a lack there of integration into society and away from combat that he hadn't really addressed or thought of. And yet the psyche knew, right? And so this is the transpersonal, if you will, part of it, I would think. But, maybe there's other pieces to this that you're seeing as well.
Well, I don't profess to have the answer, but like, for instance, do we, when we experience things that seize us, where we have an emotional seizure of something, and it presents itself as foreign or alien, but very much has its own organization, and that's why I would call it some kind of agency or micro agency to itself. It awakens us in a different way, and so I was trying to use a dialectical logic of internal modification that builds kind of on itself, and that becomes more rich and robust in its organizational form as it then comes into consciousness. So the question that you, I think, are raising for me is there an unconscious kind of subjectivity that's directing the process? Or is it, as you put it, a transpersonal mediatory factor that it's coming from something else? And maybe that's the Jungian collective unconscious impersonal thing. Or is there any differentiation between, let's say, an unconscious ego that's directing things, that's the true soul, that's the inner psychic authenticity that says you need to get to that, aspect of your dream. You're trying to compensate or trying to integrate or trying to reorganize these split off elements of psyche. And so this is what's hard for me to, of course, know, not working with your patient.
Yeah, of course.
But I'm attempting to try to understand. So another point here is that how often do we, like dreaming, to use that example, where it's like, this does not feel like it's coming from me or my psyche. It's being superimposed and I'm reacting to it. So we're not aware of our inner self, we're not aware of the self performing the agentic function of, let's say, teleologically trying to solve something or integrate something or make meaning of it. But because we can't self-reflectively be aware of our self-reflective function in the moment. It's only later that we can say, oh, that's probably what was happening here. But what's fascinating to me, and I do not have the answer here, is there really this locus of freedom in the psyche that generates all these things? And is it the spontaneity of psyche, or is this really my unconscious self that's operating? This is, I don't profess to have the answer to that, but it's fascinating all the same. It has to come from somewhere. And because I don't believe in hard determination, I don't believe that we are simply, causally determined. We are determinative, and we work within our embodiment and our psychic processes. I would hate to think, or I just have a hard time even imagining having a sense of choice and agency and freedom of will if we were to only view the psyche as some kind of, determined causal thing that's based on, synapses in the brain that are firing off and etc. I'll stop there.
So my name's Eric Goodwyn, obviously. Real briefly, just kind of give you some background. I got interested in Jung when I was a resident. So 15 years ago or so. And much to my excitement, my department chair was not a huge fan of Jung. And so that was an interesting journey in and of itself. Perhaps not quite as dramatic as John's, but a near-death experience of my own, as it were. Anyway, despite that good-natured teasing on his part, I mean, I couldn't stop anyway. I just went wild with it. I got very fascinated with the concept of the archetype and really wanted to know more about it. Came at it from a very different angle that John has. And I have not read Hegel. I'm not familiar with Deleuze, other than the name. I know a little bit about these things, but not much. Instead, coming at it from the biological point of view, the anthropological point of view. Later on, I added to that. So I wanted to address three things today. Mainly, it kind of in response to some of the great questions that arose as a result of John's talk. And so to kind of further the discussion, I think the first is to kind of get into this business of the mind-body problem, but I don't want to dominate the whole talk with that because I've got some other things I think it would be fun to get into as well on the archetypes more in particular. The book deals with this quite a bit more. We do get into the weeds a little bit with the mind-body problem. Just to kind of give you all an idea. One of the, I guess, discussion points that comes about in the book is when John is talking about the psyche. From the perspective I was coming at it was philosophy of mind, is the boundaries of the psyche. Where does the personal psyche end? And I have come across Atmanspacher's work as well. We've talked about our different approaches. I don't think his approach and mine is necessarily incompatible. I think John and my approach is very compatible. But just to give you a feel for what we talk about there in a few minutes, the mind-body problem is, of course, about the relationship to mind and body, or matter and psyche. And of course, the number one problem here is that these two things are kind of hard to really nail down in of themselves. If you go with a strictly dualistic point of view, a so-called Cartesian point of view, for example, you can claim with Descartes that mind and matter are ontologically distinct rather than just merely conceptually distinct. Doing that leads to all kinds of problems, however, and I don't want to overload the discussion with that. Phenomenologists have offered up some great critiques of that, but even within philosophy itself, we're seeing a whole lot more criticism of that point of view, and this very similar point of view, which would be physicalism. And physicalism is the perspective that mind derives entirely from matter and is completely derivative of it. Now, what does this have to do with Jung? Well, Jung was not a philosopher. I think he may have wanted to be, but he really just didn't come at this problem with enough gusto to really get out of some of the ambiguities. Nevertheless, he had very strong intuitions about this, and he was very much against a dualistic approach of saying that mind and matter are fully separate in some way, which is why he came up with the idea of the psychoid. And whatever it is you think of that concept, that's where it kind of led for him, I think. But here's a quote from him, kind of expressing this, where he says, just as the body has an anatomical prehistory of millions of years, so also does the psychic system. And just as the human body today represents in each of its parts the result of this evolution, and everywhere still shows traces of its earlier stages, so the same may be said of the psyche. Or elsewhere, he says, psyche and matter are contained in one of the same world, and they're moreover in continuous contact with one another, and ultimately rest on an irrepresentable transcendent factor. And therefore, it's not only possible, but fairly probable that psyche and matter are two different aspects of one and the same thing. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why I think that Atmanspacher's work in particular on the dual aspect monism perspective is so interesting, because he clearly had that point of view from the beginning. So how does that, what does that have to do with this now? So from the point of view of the philosophy of mind, the question then comes, what is the final relationship between mind and matter? Because we really can't talk much about archetypes until we get a handle on this, because Jung proposed all sorts of sort of transcendent and almost cosmic definitions later in his life. Now, earlier in his life, he started with a merely biological point of view and defined them in biological terms, which I'm a big fan of, and you can read my works to get into all that. I actually don't think that it's incompatible with the biological formulation to go deeper into this and viewing archetypes as fundamental organizers of experience or mind/matter. I think it's a natural progression, really. But before we get into before we get too deep into that, let's take a look at physicalism. Okay, so physicalism, I'm going to spend just a minute on that because it's a very popular view among philosophers of mind. And it's essentially the idea that matter is fundamental. It's prior to, or excuse me, matter is fundamental and prior to mind. And that we should be able to explain someday with super advanced neuroscience, maybe, how it is that buzzing neurons can somehow create things like the sound of a melody or the taste of Guinness, all right, or something like that. How in the world that works is left open to future discoveries, but physicalists maintain, though, that must be the only way it can possibly work. So I believe personally that physicalism is completely incompatible with Jungian theory. And this is one of the reasons why we need to understand the problems with it, because I think if it turned out to be the correct metaphysics, then we would have to radically restructure Jungian theory. Okay, now I'll explain why. First of all is what they call the explanatory gap problem. So the explanatory gap problem is basically isolated molecules or even cells do not appear to have any sort of conscious awareness, or qualia, if you're familiar with that term. Qualia are subjective qualities of experience, colors, sounds. Thomas Nagel, for example, talks about how we may be able to understand the vibrations of air and how it operates on the aural nerve, but that still doesn't really explain why sounds sound the way they do versus some other way. Or another way to put this would be using pain fibers. We can describe quite accurately that when pain fibers fire, the person attached to those pain fibers will complain and say that hurts. But what we can't explain is why pain fibers firing feels like ouch rather than some other thing it could potentially be. That's the explanatory gap problem right there. So where do these qualia come from, these phenomenal characteristics? Aggregates of and isolated bits of matter are not conscious, but when you arrange them just so, they are. Put another way, the human body is composed of carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen. A living human body will be composed of all four of those things and some trace elements. A dead body is also composed of those four trace elements, of those four elements and other trace things. So what's the difference? Well, clearly there's a huge difference between a living body and a dead one. So what's up with that? So it's the same kind of thing. Now, this has led certain philosophers, most famously David Chalmers, to propose what he called the hard problem of consciousness, which John brought up. And the hard problem of consciousness is hard because this is it. It's how do I span this explanatory gap? How do I get from buzzing neurons to, ode to joy? How does that work? The easy problem of consciousness is identifying the correlates, the neural correlates of consciousness, which we're very close to being able to do with quite a bit of detail now. But so what? Right? It doesn't really get at what philosophers want to know. Okay, it may satisfy neuroscientists, but not many others. So philosophers have tried to get around this issue a number of different ways. One of them is identity theory, which is to say that that the buzzing neurons and the experience are simply the same thing, and it's a semantic problem. Yeah, the counter argument to that is quite extensive, but I'll just leave that one to you. I think it's absurd. They're clearly different. If they're not distinguishable, then they're identical, but these are clearly distinguishable. Okay. The other one is eliminativism, which is a really kind of curious position, if you ask me. And it's one that Daniel Dennett and Susan Blackmore have put forth, that the idea that consciousness is an illusion or it doesn't exist. So, it just makes me wonder who it is that came up with this theory then, since they're arguing themselves out of existence, essentially. But hey, what do I know? I'm not a huge fan of it, obviously. I think it's absurd. And the way to get to, I guess, counter this eliminativist attempt to get over the explanatory gap problem, the way I put it is, okay, fine. Let's assume that you're correct and that consciousness is a convenient fiction that the brain creates in order to function. And it conjures up a world that is coherent and unified, even though its origin is in multiplicity, within neurons firing and doing all of their shenanigans and so forth. Even if you assume that and you say what it appears to be is not what it really is, it's an illusion, that doesn't get rid of it. All that does is it sidesteps the problem. Okay, in other words, a dollar bill in my hand may not really be worth anything, but I've still got to explain the dollar, right? So there's something there that we're seeing, and just calling an illusion doesn't magically get rid of it. So that's that. So now, the way that I'm approached this is I look at this as a part whole problem, essentially. There's a few other folks that have looked at it like this before. Philip Goff, for example, is one. My approach is pretty similar to his, and there's some other folks out there too. But the idea is essentially emerged from a famous paper by Jonathan Schaeffer. It came out in 2010. It was talking about the priority of the whole. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this paper, but it's okay. I got a couple of people nodding there. Yeah. Now, I talked to Schaeffer about his paper as I was working on my own paper on philosophy of mind. And he told me something that really shocked me, was that he was a physicalist. He said, I'm just a garden variety physicalist. And I thought, how in the world can you justify that point of view, given this fact that you've argued so eloquently that the whole is prior to the parts? But the essential, I guess, difference that we had was that he did not feel that consciousness should be viewed in that sense, as a whole or a property of a whole. And that's the way I'm looking at it. All right, so the common feature here is the mirology of it. In other words, which is prior, the whole or the part? Do the properties of the parts arise from the property of the whole from which they were pulled? Or is it the other way around? Do properties of wholes come solely from the properties of parts? Okay, so a little bit of reflection will reveal to you that there are plenty of cases where the wholes have properties that the parts don't have, right? There's a whole field of mathematics that is devoted to this, right? Complex systems theory, what they used to call chaos theory. And it's in particular types of wholes, the interactiveness and the integratedness of it is so dense that new properties come emergent there. Now, so John was talking a little bit earlier about supervenience and saying this is one of the problems. And it is a problem in the sense that we have to explain where these properties come from. Since they don't come from the parts, from whence do they emerge, right? Now, if you think about this really closely, you'll realize this is the same problem as the mind-body problem. It's saying, I've got neurons, I've got the body, I've got all these molecules and everything, and they're working just so, and from that I have consciousness. That's a property of the whole that if you separated them all, if you took all of the billions of neurons in the brain and put them each separately in its own petri dish, you wouldn't have a consciousness from that. Not a human consciousness anyway. You might have individual neuron consciousnesses, but that's a different question. You've got to put them all together and let them work together, and then you have it. Okay, so then where does that come from? So this point of view of essentially proposing that the properties of the whole are prior to the properties of the parts is basically flipping the usual way people tend to look at it. Now, I say the usual way, yeah, within the last 100 years or so, sure. The physicalist position has been more dominant. But if you go further back into history of ideas, you'll see that the other way around is actually pretty common all the way on back. The Neoplatonists, for example, would be a great example of how they view the one as the source of all properties and all everythings through their emanations. And I don't think we have to use emanations per se. But again, if you want to get into the weeds on that, you can read the book, because John and I get into the weeds with that one. But the general principle is that a holistic view of consciousness is the only way that really gets around the hard problem without just creating more problems, because it says the way that matter creates mind is that it doesn't. Instead, it's that consciousness or mind is a property of a holistic system operating in just so as it needs to in order to generate that. Okay, so then that often will lead to questions of, okay, well then how is it that you've got a embryo, say, and then it's developing along and now all of a sudden it's conscious? Where did that consciousness come from within this paradigm? So within this paradigm, I'm not allowed to say that adding more neurons and atoms to the embryo and the properties therein somehow creates consciousness. No, what I'm saying is, as the body develops, it acquires a form that correlates with consciousness more and more and more as it develops. So I'm moving towards a form which is conducive to or correlative with that property. Now, if I do that, then I have to keep going. There's nothing that says I have to stop at one person. Okay. Now, if you're paying close attention to the type of panpsychism, all right. Panpsychism says psyche is a fundamental feature of the universe. This is actually much more a popular position now than it was even 5 years ago. And Chalmers was one of the first ones to really solidify a powerful argument for panpsychism. Now, here's the problem, though. With panpsychism, you've got two broad varieties. You've got micropsychism, which says each individual molecule in the entire universe has its own little micropsyche. And if you say that, then you have bought yourself something called the combination problem, which is, okay, let's assume each individual neuron has its own little microneuron psyche. Why is it that jamming them together gives you one macropsyche? Right? William James proposed this as a famous combination problem. And there's been other versions of this throughout the history of ideas. But if you'll notice, though, that's still a part whole problem. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's saying the properties of the whole are somehow being derived from the properties of the parts. And how does that work? Now, I didn't notice this until I came across Marsilio Ficino, of all people. And when I was reading his Platonic ontology or Platonic theology, he goes through this very simple argument for holism and says essentially, how in the world is it we're expecting a unity to come from multiplicity? That's contradictory. And as soon as I read that, I thought, there it is. That's the problem. That's the problem that these people are doing. That's the hard problem with consciousness. That's the binding problem in neuroscience, if you're familiar with that. And it's the combination problem all in a nutshell. And the only way to get around it that I can see, unless someone comes up with some other miraculous way, is to say, you know what? It's got to be the other way around. It's got to be that the properties of the whole are prior. And that the only reason you get them is because you move towards a form which brings them into existence. So then what that means is the closer you are to that form, the more you will have consciousness emerge within that system. And there's either one most potentially integrated form in the universe, or you have to say it's the entire universe itself. So this is really an argument for cosmopsychism. Okay. And I've already gone on over more of that than I really wanted to. So that's the ontology that I think works best to solve the mind-body problem. And I believe it's fully compatible with the way John has described it from, I think in his view, a much more modest position of saying, well, okay, but let's just look at it from the human lens. And that's totally fair. That's totally fair. I do not blame that. Now, a couple of other things that were brought up in the discussion session I wanted to address because they impinge on this. That's our foundation, whether you accept the cosmopsychist analysis or not. What we're really both talking about is having things emerge into consciousness spontaneously that have a profound effect, and they have this recurrent nature, the archetypes. So what and the otherness that John spoke of, that as a quality. Okay, so it's that feature of them I think is extremely important. And something that I've been working on more recently, and I saw several folks working on in Zurich earlier this year, was the concept of spontaneous thought. Okay, so spontaneous thought is a field of neuroscience that has gained quite a bit of momentum in the last 10 years. And it emerged really from just a simple question of what is the brain doing when you're not doing anything? If you're just sitting there vibing and you're not working on any particular problems, is the brain just dormant or is it doing stuff? Okay, well, obviously it's the latter because nature abhors a vacuum and it's also very stingy with energy resources. And if you're not working actively on some kind of conscious puzzle or problem or issue, it reverts to what they call the default mode. And there's been a lot of interesting neuroscience about that. But then the question is, okay, well, what is the default mode doing? Like, what's the point of it? And we'll get to this features that John pointed out earlier as we go, because they're evident there. That's what I think is really, really neat about this. So before we get to archetypes, I just want to have a few words on this idea of the spontaneous thought, because they're very, very closely related. So archetypal images emerge in a non-willfully directed way. So they are a subset of spontaneous thought in general. So if we look at the science of spontaneous thought, how it works and what it's accomplishing, we may be able to look at some of those and say, are some of those spontaneous thoughts, can they be definable as archetypal? And of course, I think they definitely they are. The key feature of spontaneous thought is that it is not willfully directed. Very important feature. And it's something that Jung and von Franz talk about in their work. Warren Coleman has talked about it in some of his work on the emergence of the imagination. Great stuff, even though he doesn't believe that archetypes exist and he criticizes some of my work, but that's okay. I'll let him live anyway. But it's fascinating the way that that feature, which I think has such profound implications for archetype theory, hasn't been talked about enough. So I'm going to talk about it more. And generally speaking, when you look at if you dive into the literature of spontaneous thought, which I won't do and get too deep in the weeds on that, but if you dive into it, what you can find is that the thoughts that emerge seemingly out of the blue, that don't have anything to do necessarily with what you're working on in the moment, often have very common features. Okay, they seem to be very beneficial as well. Number one, they're non-random, which I think any psychoanalyst worth their salt would have told you. We all knew that already, but of course they had to rule that out because they're neuroscientists and they have to, be that way. So that's one feature. It's not random chimerical wish fulfillments either. It's spontaneous thoughts have features of working on current emotionally relevant problems, and or they are occupied with future planning and anxieties that center around future planning. They are all colored by those current features. Okay, they're focused on emotionally salient personal concerns. They involve memory consolidation and future planning, also relevant to current issues. It can misfire. It can go wrong, which you see in obsessions or ruminations. But for the most part, in the normal situation, they're working on making our lives better, if you will. Like there's a process in the psyche that says, I need to put this stuff together. I need to figure out where I am and what it all means and who I am. So this, interestingly enough, this science has become so, I guess, prevalent that one of the ones that I quote in a paper that will be coming out soon says that we should really call this the era of the wandering mind, because that's another name for spontaneous thought, is study of wandering thoughts or wandering mind thoughts. In fact, one researcher says that we shouldn't call it mind wandering. We should call it mind ordering, because that seems to be what the function of these thoughts is. So now you can see this not only in just spontaneous thoughts that pop up, but in dreams, because dreams are now being more and more recognized as just another type of spontaneous thought that happens while we're asleep. They tend to be more vivid and more intense, but they still follow the same patterns in terms of their characteristics and features. So the long story short of this is that what we know about spontaneous thought from this body of research matches pretty closely what Jung called the transcendent function. So now, if we get into that, now the transcendent function, well, what is that? That's a unconscious process that is working towards integration. That's the short definition, right? We've all heard that. And its focus is on continually operating in the background, and it will order dream content as well. And so I think that's a great way of looking at this new research in spontaneous thought as our old friend, the transcendent function. Why? Because what the research says is basically that these thoughts are oriented around as the same stuff that Jung was talking about. He says that, the researchers are saying that spontaneous thoughts generally focus on autobiographical self-narrative with as much context as possible. They orient towards meaning and identity creation, and affectively oriented context creation. And I think one of the best ways you can categorize it in your mind is that what the function of this process is to answer the question, who am I? Now, the question, who am I, doesn't mean you navel gaze endlessly into the bottomless depths and out emerges this, magical definition. No, the nuts and bolts of it operate more simply. It's, how do I connect with this person? How do I connect with that person? How do I connect with society? How do I connect with the world? This connects into religious ideas because they ask, who are you in the context of the entire universe and the eternity? Same thing. And it's always operating on the background, no matter what we're doing. It is flexible too. If we're under less stress, it becomes more playful. It becomes more exploratory. And you see this in dream content as well, which is why Jung said that a person who is not really distressed, as they get better, their dreams become harder to interpret rather than easier, which I'm sure everyone has noticed that. But when we're under a lot of stress, when we're really struggling, it becomes easier to interpret it because they narrow the focus down on the most emotionally salient issues that we're dealing with right now. And this applies not only to spontaneous thought, but dreams. And as I was reading this, I was thinking, oh, this is just what psychoanalysts have been saying since the early days. That if you pay close attention to what emerges spontaneously, without direction, without judgment, and just let it process and bring into awareness, or focus specifically without trying to direct the imagery and see where it comes in and attend to it closely. Well, what's that called? Active imagination, right? So they've even done studies on that. They didn't know that's what they were doing, but that's what they were doing. They were studying this process, and they found that, lo and behold, especially when it's image heavy, it leads to a reduction of symptoms depending on whatever it is they're working on. Wow, that's cool. Okay, so then how does that, two questions jump out at me here. One is, how does this relate to what John was talking about? at the deepest fundamental level of the descriptions that he gives of how these archetypes emerge. And all of this to me says, well, look, he discussed the intentionality behind it. He discussed the relation to lack. So the lack would be the emotional valence, I think, because emotions essentially evolved in order for us to solve particular environmental problems, and they motivate behavior towards or away from whatever it may be, whether it's rage, it's lust, it's hunger, or grief. All of these things and have evolved within the human context to solve various problems. Well, that's the intentionality behind them. Now, if we have time, we can get into how that relates to the question that was raised about dissociative identity disorder. It was a really good question. I have worked with some patients with dissociative identity disorder and dissociative amnesia, so we can get into that if you want to. But anyway, so now, how does that then relate to the question of the archetypes? That's the other piece that jumps out. So we're already getting pretty close to the way John described how they emerge when you look really closely at the phenomenology of them and the characteristics that they display. And I think what you have to do, if you're going to come at it from this other angle, from this neuroscience angle that I'm doing, we have to take a look at the idea of embodied cognition and answer the question of, okay, given that we have spontaneous thoughts that are purposeful and oriented towards solving particular emotional problems, is it possible that a subset of those are purely innately driven? Because what we know about spontaneous thoughts, not only about what they're trying to do, but how they're constructed. And particularly you can see this in dreams, but spontaneous thoughts are not just regurgitations of memories. They're not just retreading of stuff that's happened to you. There wouldn't be much point in that, really. And even in the case of memory consolidation, which it is a part of that process, memory consolidation, as we all know, is not a perfect reproduction of what happened. Memory, in fact, is not a process of storing things that are retrieved later. You've all heard these computer metaphors. That's garbage. It doesn't work like that at all. In fact, memory retrieval, if you will, it should not even really be called that. It should be called an imaginary construction of something that more or less resembles something that happened to you a week ago or 10 days, 10 years ago or whatever it is. It's all using the imagination. Okay, so that's how important that is. So even in that process, even in the process of memory consolidation, it's not just regurgitating of past events. As John pointed out, there is a creativity behind this. There is a non-determinate nature to this. And I don't have a problem with free will, because I say, well, that's just another property of a system that's complex enough. Boom, there you go. I don't need to I don't need to get any deeper into it than that. Of course, that troubles many people out there, but I think both of us would certainly agree that there is a freedom here, and it's very powerful. And I think if we didn't have it, we wouldn't have survived to this point already. So clearly, it's adaptive. Okay, so as it's creating these solutions and it's creating these images and so forth, what it's doing is it's taking the memories that have happened to us and breaking them down into pieces and then reorganizing them into new narratives, new images. And I argue that particularly in dreams, what they're doing is, whereas memory consolidation is a part of dreaming and spontaneous thought, there's another layer. The first layer of memory consolidation is important. It tells us, here is a coherent narrative of my life up to this point in terms of the events that have occurred. This, then this, then this, then this. But the psyche doesn't stop there. The psyche says, okay, that's cool. Now let's break it all up and come up with a new narrative, an image that expresses what it actually means. Okay, so I've got what happened and then what it means. And what it means uses symbolism. And the reason it uses symbolism is because symbolism is a great way to embody a huge amount of information in a very compact and easy to remember form. Okay, so it's no shock or surprise that a significant chunk of spontaneous thoughts are actually images like this that you can analyze just like dreams. Well, isn't that what psychoanalysts have been doing and saying for a long time? Yes. So this is independent, corroboration, if you will. Not that we really need that, but it's just an independent view into this process, and they're coming to the same conclusion. One set of data is working with folks in a clinical setting, and then the other orientation is these various studies that they use with neuroscientific tools. And it's fun that they both come together. All right, so now, one thing to learn about the symbolism, all right, now we're not to archetypes yet, but we're getting there. One thing that's important about the symbolism is that it is embodied. Okay, so what does that mean? Embodied cognition is a subfield of psychology that emerged in the 80s, starting with George Lakoff's view of the metaphors we live by. Lakoff and Johnson, excuse me, famous book called Metaphors We Live By. And the information has progressed since then. And long story short is that the human mind tends to create and think in metaphors because of their conceptual power. And these are embodied metaphors. In other words, it tends to do things like take very abstract and difficult to define concepts and map them onto things that are concrete and visuospatial. The example that they give in Metaphors We Live By is love is a journey. And it takes the concept of love, which is nebulous in the extreme, and maps it onto this idea of a physical journey through time and space. And they note how when people talk about it, they use this metaphor as an underlying metaphor all the time. They talk about how we're in different places, we're going in different directions, we're not together on this, and we're, all that kind of stuff. And they identify many, many, many other examples like this. And if you read that work and the subsequent work, you can see a lot of this. You can see how we organize the concept of happiness as up. For example, we'll say I'm flying high with good feelings. I'm on cloud 9, whereas we describe depression, which is already within the descriptor itself, depression, as down. I'm feeling down in the dumps. I'm depressed. There's a whole slew of these that I go over some in Neurobiology of the Gods, but there's plenty more. Attachment loss is cold is another one. So-and-so left me out in the cold. So-and-so gave me the cold shoulder, right? Whereas the opposite is also another metaphor that we use often. Why do we do this? Well, I think the reason is because of the embodiedness of cognition. So this is kind of feeds into the idea of the mind-body problem also. Because what we're doing is we're saying that matter has a psyche to it. It has a psychological dimension to it. And at the same time, psyche is enmattered. It's embodied in a very, very strong sense. So now, I argue that this dimension is required if we're going to talk about archetypes. And many of the Jungian authors and post-Jungians and so forth have talked a lot about how the archetypal images are very symbolic. And they do the same sort of thing. They take a difficult to describe or verbalize concept and they map it onto a symbol so that we can get a better handle on it. Now, when you do that, what you do is you bring in what they call in embodied cognition an ineffable core of meaning. And the best way to describe that is to just look at the fact that if you were to describe the metaphor, say, of danger is darkness, right? Very commonly used metaphor. It's found in all sorts of fairy tales of going into the dark forest, or joining the dark side, right? It's in a lot of popular media. It's all of this kind of danger, the unknown is mapped to darkness as an image. Now, danger is not literally the same thing as darkness. It's a metaphor. But how do you describe it? The only way to describe it, because of this ineffable core of meaning that all metaphors have, is to use other metaphors, right? So that's a very key feature here. And I argue that the archetypal nature of this comes from the fact that there's a subset of these that utilize the human body as the basis for the metaphor. And these are universal physiological elements of the human body. All right, this gets to the question too of, do archetypes evolve? So I'm going to get to that. Whoever it was that asked that question, because it's a great question. Okay. So now I think that this ineffable core of meaning that metaphors have gets at a lot of the so-called mysticism that Jung is accused of. Because, and Hillman even too, when he talks about how the archetypes defy final analysis. They're capable of endlessly being articulated verbally. Roger Brooke, who I greatly admire his work, talks about this too, and how archetypes seem to be mysterious, deep, remote, frightening, enchanting. Thinking about them remains equally murky and ambivalent. Okay, now I look at that and I say that's due to the ineffable core meaning that metaphors have. It's not because the archetype needs to be that muddy and impossible to understand. It's because the archetypal image is a symbol. So in other words, the moon may be mysterious, but the finger pointing at it doesn't have to be so bloody mysterious, okay? So I think if we're making this distinction, we don't have to be quite so challenged in our understanding of what an archetype is. Okay, so now the biological dimension of this that I see in all of the various archetypal images that we've seen and talked about throughout Jungian literature, the child, the mother, the eternal youth, the hero, the divine marriage, the sacrifice, these are all fundamental human occurrences. These are fundamental environmentally evoked responses that the spontaneously thinking psyche will come up with, and it'll use these metaphors that are found in all human beings to create these narratives of meaning. Oh, that's what this means. I'm dealing now to answer my own question earlier. The ceremony of the warrior returning, it was his way of coming up with that feeling of needing to be integrated. Well, how do I describe that? How do I create an image of that in my dream? Boom. It was the urban combat, the bloody uniform, the people looking at him that were all drunk, and then returning back to it because the dream is telling us where we are right now. And that's spontaneous thoughts do that too. And it was like the psyche had not quite figured out the correct solution to this, which is why the bomb couldn't be diffused, right? The ego couldn't figure it out. So you wound up with the explosion. So now integrating archetypal theory with embodied metaphor theory is the final step here to get at what an archetypal image is. And that's a spontaneously affectively charged complex metaphor of our current life situation. Those emerge spontaneously all the time. But there's a subset of those that use primarily innate metaphorical associations. Okay, so one of the things that they discovered about embodied metaphors is that you have a lot of complex metaphors, but they can easily decompose into these primary metaphors. They can't be further decomposed. Okay, happy is up, sadness is down, affection is warmth, danger is darkness, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now I argue that some of those primary metaphors are innate, meaning that they derive solely from our own human-bodied experience, and that's why they can be labeled as innate. I don't need to learn that danger is darkness because I'm a member of a species that has lousy night vision and I feel really uncomfortable in the darkness. And so then that metaphor can be used in any of my spontaneous thoughts, and it'll be found in any human being, in any culture, anywhere. And that, I think, speaks to what John was talking about as the essence of the archetypes spread out. And I think John brought up the question, why is that? How is that accomplished? And I think this might give us a clue as to one of the reasons why. It's because in a very, I think, real sense, we can argue that the collective unconsciousness is the human body, because the psyche uses the body in this way to construct so many of these metaphors. And there's a ton of them. There's a ton of them that I've identified, and I'm sure there's others that people will find The danger is darkness. Well, the opposite of that, knowledge, safety, happiness is light. Power or happiness is up, followed by weakness, and sadness is down. All of these you can identify as spontaneously emergent because of our human physiology. And in fact, you can even see this in people born blind. They're still able to understand these metaphors with no problem. So I don't even think you need to have any particular experiences to feed into these, no matter how generic and universal those experiences might be. That we're just set up for these sorts of primary metaphors. Understanding is grasping. Understanding is grasping is a metaphor that would make absolutely no sense to a horse. If a horse could think like a human and construct metaphors, they wouldn't do that. Rats would never come up with danger is darkness because they're safer in the darkness. They would have light is dark, is danger is light. So it's not so much that the experience needs to occur, it's what our natural innate response to that experience is that gives us the innate quality that we're talking about for an archetypal image. Okay, this is why worldwide you have children who are many children afraid of the dark, but there are very few children afraid of the light. And if that's the case, that probably has to do with some kind of photophobia, and a variety of rare conditions that can cause that. But even in that sense, it's not really a phobia; it's that it hurts. But children are afraid of the dark. There aren't any children afraid of light that run away from it. Okay, so you get the idea. Whereas if we were owls, right, we wouldn't do that either, because that's when we're hunting. It's when the fun is. It's when it's dark. And we would be able to function very highly in that environment. Okay, so the long story short then is that you can take these primary metaphors to construct, and this answers the question of whether or not they evolve. Every human being is, as by virtue of the human genome and the way that the psyche develops naturally, are going to have a whole alphabet of these primary, what I call innate mappings. They're innate mappings anybody would have anywhere because they have a human body. And they are able to then use them to construct all sorts of images that are going to pop up in these spontaneous thoughts and dreams. Anger is heat is another one. I'll end with this one because this is one of my favorite ones. Anger is heat fuels a whole lot of metaphors. Boiling over with anger, burning with rage, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Now, I brought this up with Christian Rusler this past summer. And he said, well, yeah, but you still have to have the experience that goes along with it. And so he was trying to say that it's not innate, which I think misses the point. If our body temperature went down when we got angry, we would not construct this metaphor, but we do. It goes up. But even in the case, all right, so even still, if it's only something that's just learned, we say this because we hear other people say comparing anger with heat, it has nothing to do with the biology, then it should not be found in other languages. Okay, it should be fairly unique to or idiosyncratic to English, but it isn't. The anger is heat metaphor has been found in English, Chinese, Japanese, Hungarian, Tahitian, Chickasaw, and Wolof so far as guiding underlying primary metaphors to guide these different types of complex metaphors. Okay. Universal. So I think that putting this together in this manner helps us define archetypal images and with a great deal of clarity and precision, and kind of demystifies them to a degree, although it doesn't necessarily demystify the ultimate meaning of the archetypes, because that can't really be gotten at because it's an ineffable core of metaphorical meaning. But we can at least get a better handle on the imagery. Now, what leads to this process happening, I think, is what John identifies so well in his investigations, and what must occur in order for these things to be built. And I think there's definitely more work we could do, John, on this, bridging these processes, because I see a lot of what you talk about in this process here. And also we can, doing it this way means we can also look at spontaneous thoughts and identify which ones are archetypal and which ones are not. Because the ones that aren't are going to be the ones that are not created with innate mappings. For example, there are a lot of there are a lot of metaphors in Chinese that organize around the primary metaphor that happiness is flowers in the heart. That's not an innate mapping, because flowers are not automatically emergent from the human body, right? So that's a cultural metaphor. You could argue that that's at the cultural layer, and you'll see, I'm sure you'll see that. In Zulu, they have anger is the grinding of corn, right? Also not innate. So when you see things that are organized around those, you can say, okay, that's not an archetypal. It may still have loads of meaning that you can analyze and explore. But now I've got a way to say, this is archetypal and this isn't. And we haven't had that in Jung's theory for ever, I think. And there's been plenty of people that argue that practically everything is an archetype, right? So I think this does confer some advantages here. So in conclusion, I'll wrap this up and say that I think an archetypal image can be clearly and easily identified as a spontaneous, affect-charged, complex metaphor for one's current species-specific typical life situation that is mainly composed of innate mappings. And from there, we have a number of advantages. Number one, we can assess what is archetypal and what is not. It's falsifiable. We can do like we did with anger with heat, go cross-culturally and see if it's there too. And if it is, that's much more likely that it's an innate mapping. All the innate mappings that I propose can be done like this. It even helps us interpret the images too. If I have an understanding of why the body and the psyche using the body constructs metaphors in a particular way, given our unique physiology, then I can work the other way at an image that I might be mystified by and say, okay, so there's a lot of heat here. I wonder if anger is a part of this imagery, where it may not be obvious in the clinical setting. So it gives us a few more tools that we can use to understand and interpret those things. It helps us to understand why archetypal image can be so elusive and mysterious too, because it is a metaphor and it's constructed in order to express a human experience that might not be verbalizable. And because we have thought in imagery as a species far longer than we've thought in words, and in fact cross species, that's probably the case since most of them don't have languages. Although we are finding that more species have languages than we originally thought. Nevertheless, the ability to think in imagery and to use metaphorical imagery is probably not anywhere near as new as verbalizing and constructing languages. So my apologies to Lacan for that. Anyway, we can also look at how archetypal images, despite their biological origin, do not have to be rigid. They can respond to large cultural shifts, because the innate alphabet will not change, but the way that the alphabet organizes symbolism may be quite different depending on where you are in your culture. And those expressions of the spirit of the depths that is talked about is going to be still possible to use with innate mappings, but they're going to be potentially different depending on the where you are in the a long-term, long-scale changes. And then finally, it helps us to understand why mythic narratives can look so similar, but they're not identical worldwide. If they were identical, this would be a whole lot easier. We would just say we have an automatic tendency to do this, right? Boom, there it is. But it's not that way. It's because the alphabet is identical. But the words that are constructed with that alphabet are not necessarily going to be the same. Nevertheless, there's still going to be this sneaky similarity that dogs us Jungians and mythographers across the world. And so hopefully that sheds more light on my point of view and how I think it integrates with John's. And I look forward to any questions.
Speakers wanted to wrap up with a bit of a dialogue between themselves, and we're approaching the end of our time. So turn it over to Eric and John to facilitate us going out the door. Thanks.
Well, John, I said a lot about your work, and hopefully I didn't mess any of it up.
No, not a bit. I should say to the group that this has been one of my more enjoyable scholarly projects. I think both of us had really generated a lot of originality that from our dialogues, and it started from Eric had critiqued my article on the essence of archetypes, and then I got excited as someone's actually critiquing me, criticizing my thought, and then I responded to him with my own thought, and then he responded back to me, and that's how we cobbled this book together. And it went from what is an archetype to then it went to what is the psyche, and then where what we depart from is that Eric launches off into this grand metaphysics where I'm much more timid about it, and I'd rather stay within my little realm. And he had this bold leap, and to go to the notion that the psyche emanates from a cosmic psychic process is quite ambitious. And I certainly think it resonates with anybody who's interested in, in cosmology and in greater questions around God, theology, the bigger metaphysical questions is something that we get into, and I think in detail we get into. And given that, I'm got a philosophical background in psychology, and Eric has a philosophical but scientific background as a psychiatrist, that we just came at things from all these different angles, and I think they are very compatible if you are patient with, I'm a very dense writer, so where Eric is much more friendly, idea friendly, you can grab onto, as you could tell from our talks. The one thing that came out of for myself was to have to think about, well, what is psyche? And so I have a chapter in there on what I call Psy world as a means of kind of mediating the notion of embodiment and experience. And maybe it's similar to Jung's notion of essa and anima, being and soul, and the psychoid function. But I believe I have another book on my plate to finish around that exploratory work. The one thing that I'm going to bracket and still remain bracketed, but let Eric have a free-for-all with, is the notion that the cosmos is conscious, or that the cosmos has cognition. And I have to maintain my philosophical bracket there, because it really raises a lot of questions, such as, how could the universe ponder itself? Now, how does it mirror the properties and experiences of the human being? Now, to his credit, he has an internally consistent logic that makes sense, that you end up solving the mereological problem of the whole and the parts, but it still presupposes the whole. And this is a standard criticism of Neoplatonism, of so Plotinus, as well as Spinozian panpsychism. At the same time, you have the celebrated monists, Hegel, Whitehead, who would fall into this scheme that I think Eric is fitting in. So I am very impressed, and I hope that he continues to develop his own Jungian metaphysics.
Thank you. I'm sure I will. Yeah. As far as the presupposition angle goes, as you'll, if you read the book and the argument that I defend there, it's not so much that I really like having that in there. It's just that I realize that you have a presupposition no matter what metaphysics you come at, and that one at least has fewer problems than the other ones do. And so unless you want to propose that there's some kind of infinitism going on, like there's never any sort of prime mover or uncaused cause and all of that sort of stuff, and that we do know that we have consciousness because we experience it, and all of the myriad ways that we try to explain how it got there, of all of those, cosmopsychism, to me anyway, poses the fewest additional problems. But of course, that doesn't mean that there's not some other unthought of way of working it out that doesn't have that problem. Maybe some genius out there will come up with one, but anyway, there it is. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yes, well, just a final thought. You know, it's very difficult to say anything original. I mean, in today's world, I mean, everything has been done in the history of ideas, so to speak, and it's the nuances and the minutia of ideas that take us in different directions, and so it doesn't necessarily resolve the conundrums, because we're still talking about these things now. If this would be considered like just empirical facts, we would have not be debating these ideas. And I think that's what's interesting about human nature. And it goes back to the issue of, well, maybe it goes back to Plotinus, the notion of the conundrum about the many and the one. I mean, how do we deal with the notion of the universality of the psyche that is, applies to all people, regardless of who you are, time, gender, geographic location, culture, and then also accounting for the notion of particularity and difference and multiplicity and pluralities. And I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think we can get at these from different perspectives, and maybe that is the solution to this dual aspect monism, that there are many different aspects of the way we are trying to make sense out of our lives and our world.
Yeah, great points. There was one, I just now noticed the chat here with some comments on here, archetypes based on the accumulation of human experience. Now we're in the process of creating new ones. Absolutely I would say new compositions are possible all the time. I don't think there's going to be any new innate mappings anytime soon, because they're based on very, very basic physiological principles. Like when people get angry, their temperature goes up. It's simple stuff like that. But nevertheless, the new compositions of those absolutely are possible and likely, I think. And they're still archetypal under my definition anyway. But yeah, great questions. Great comments. Appreciate you guys having us.
Yeah, thank you very much.